It is now my great pleasure to introduce our after-lunch speaker, Dr. Philippa Gregory, who was this university's Alumnus of the Year in 2008. As you well know, she's an internationally known best-selling author of historical novels, which she started writing in Edinburgh when she was studying for her PhD in 18th century literature. She was studying in the morning and writing these steamy novels in the evening. The first novel, Wideacre, became an instant worldwide bestseller in 1986, and she's never looked back. It's interesting, I'm in the middle of it. I was asking her to tell me what happens, and she says it gets worse. Her breakthrough book, as they call it, was the Other Boleyn Girl, which was made into a successful film, so that Philippa is now well-known to a general reading public as a specialist one. And she is also writer-in-residence to Edinburgh University, and last evening she gave her first tutorial lecture, which I gather was a great success. From her point of view, however, her greatest achievement is the charity work she's done in Gambia, West Africa, for a charity called Gardens in Gambia, which I'm sure you'll have heard of. They build wells in schoolyards which provides drinking water for children. They build a market garden around it from which they can eat the food, sell the cash crops, and learn how to garden sustainably. Her many interests include horse riding, good food, theatre, and salsa dancing with her husband. On that note, it's my very great pleasure to invite Philippa to address us.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a very great pleasure to be here, and I'm glad we've ticked off one of my pleasures, which was good food. And if you want to come salsa dancing after, just say the word. I was invited to talk to you about libraries, since we are here so much concerned with the dissemination of information. And it occurred to me that my relationship with libraries goes back almost as far as my relationship with anything. I had the very great advantage of a benignly neglectful mother. In these days when we think our children have to be entertained and educated every single second of the day, or they will somehow deteriorate into drink-slinging psychopaths, my mother used to neglect me delightfully. That she was a very keen tennis player, and on Saturdays, without fail, we would bicycle to the tennis club at about 11 o'clock in the morning. She would give me a sandwich, and then she would say, now go to the library. And I would be requested and required to stay in the library till twilight, which library closing time, which I think was 6 o'clock in those days. And I would go into the children's library, sit on the little chairs, and read a book, and then borrow 3 books, which would take me through the week. And by that extraordinary gift of time, and I must say boredom, and you know, those of you who are parents, it would be so great to feel all right about telling one's children, you have time, be bored. It is excellent for you to be bored. You can tell I'm looking forward to the summer holidays, when I will be saying to a selection of children, yes, I know you're bored, that's educational. Go and be bored somewhere else. My mother was very dauntless in her pursuit of my boredom, and it led me to a reading habit which has absolutely sustained me through my life, and which undoubtedly taught me all I know about writing. The next probably big university library experience that I had was when I came. I suppose there was an interim time. I was a journalist for a while, and I used to have lunch breaks in which I had nothing to do. I have to say, really major investigative journalism breaks, being very few on the ground in Waterlooville haven't. But what there was a library, so I used to take my lunch break, and do those of you who are librarians, the thing you really hate us doing, I used to smuggle in my sandwiches and eat them over the books. I know how bad that is, what can I say? I just did it. And I had this determination that I would read all of English literature alphabetically. But I thought it'd be really tedious to start with A, which I assumed would be Austen, because I'd read a bit of Jane Austen by then already. So I started with Z, and I'm pleased to say that I'm one of the few people I know who are familiar with all of the works of Zola. But I didn't get much beyond Z because I decided to give up being a journalist, which wasn't very stimulating either for the readers of my newspaper or for me. And I went off to Sussex University and read my history degree, my first degree. My second degree was here at Edinburgh, And that's the time where libraries and reading and writing really came together for me, and I will be enduringly grateful for the opportunity to study here under such fine teachers and with such fine opportunities. I made rather a mistake in my choice of a PhD, that what I thought I would do, and you have to remember I was very young and very energetic, what I thought I would do would be I would read all of the books which were stocked in all of the popular circulating libraries of the 18th century, all of them. And then from that I would run an enormous computer program which would select the principal characteristics of all of these novels, and that would give me, I thought, an entire spread of everything that was of interest to the people, the readers of the 18th century, and from that I would deduce what their main concerns were. You would have to be 22 to think you could do that in 3 years. What was really great was that once I introduced this idea to the Edinburgh system, they immediately, my department, the English department in David Hume Tower, immediately introduced me to the Edinburgh computing system. And as it turned out, every single department has its allocation of computer time, and the English department's allocation of computer time was virginal. It was completely untouched, because so far people had thought you just read novels and wrote about them. What they didn't realise was that you gave them little ticks to indicate the presence of a villain, or the presence of parrots, or the presence of bandits, or whether the heroine was anorexic or not. These are key questions in the 18th century novel, and as far as I know, I'm still the only person who has addressed them with the assistance of Edinburgh computing system, where this wonderful guy who was, you know, totally focused on computers would come to me and ask me if I thought Clarissa was raped or had volunteered her virginity to Richardson. And we'd have these lengthy conversations, both of us, I must say, very nearly virgins ourselves. Rather a charming thing. So I had this brilliant idea that what I would do would be I would go around and go to all the libraries that held the catalogues of the 18th century circulating libraries. That wasn't too bad. When I started my PhD research, there were 7 libraries, you know, mostly Oxford, Cambridge, some here, one in Aberdeen, a few scattered around the UK. So I set off on this kind of little pilgrimage to these libraries, and I would turn up and say to the chief librarian, I've come to see your 18th century catalogue. And they would say, how marvellous. No one's ever come to see it before. Well, then to my sorrow, though increasing success, of course, in academic terms, I found more and more of the damn things. And in the end, I had 32 to deal with. And so the array of material that I was working with became greater and greater. I went to my supervisor, Geoffrey Carnell, a very, very wise and experienced academic, and said to him, I've found all of these. I've got photocopies of all the catalogues. Now I've got to find the books that most of them stocked. Then I'm going to read the top 200. And he said, how very interesting. Tell me how you get on. Which I thought was rather encouraging at the time. It was only after I got the damn PhD that he said to me I could have had it there for that research. That was so much research. That would have earned me a PhD, and I'd have been out in year 1, which would have been fantastic. But no, the system is such that you stay until you're old and wearied and exhausted. And so driven by, I have to say, celibacy, the enforced celibacy of 4 years in libraries, that you write filthy novels, which become enormous successes. So what can I say? It worked all right for me. But so I then embarked on this really round Britain visit to all these libraries, and I compiled this list of the books that all these libraries held in common, which is the closest to a bestseller list that the 18th century has, because most people didn't buy 18th century novels, as you know. They borrowed them from the circulating libraries. Now, since you're such an erudite gathering, and since you've had such a lovely lunch, I will let you take part in a small quiz, which is, can anybody name to me the #1 bestseller of the 18th century circulating libraries? And I warn you, we're going 1769 to 1801. You can volunteer. I don't mind putting, what have I got? I've got nothing. I'll send you a signed copy of the book if you get it. You'll die when I tell you. It's Don Quixote. Oh yes, you say, oh yes, but you didn't get it, did you? Because nobody ever gets it because it's so old. But it's actually something that was translated. And one of the lessons to all writers is that if you've got a good story, just whack it out again. So that was my top #1, and then all the ones you'd expect come down after it, including Richardson, Fielding, and a number of women writers that we've now almost forgotten, including in my top 200 list, a number of writers that have completely disappeared. So I didn't end up reading 200 novels because some of them are just lost. So should you go home and find a book in your bookshelf, you know, do double check it, because you never know what you might have there. So that was my experience of reading in depth, in length, in breadth at Edinburgh. And what I discovered when I finished my PhD and found that I was utterly unemployable by virtue of being hopelessly overeducated, far too choosy and determined to make a life in the academic world. Unfortunately, I coincided with Margaret Thatcher's joint attack on the miners and the academics. And she froze all the posts in the university, and I was forced to say to my supervisor, Geoffrey Carnell, I can see of no way of getting a job except by pushing you violently downstairs and breaking your neck. And he said, that won't do it. The post is frozen. It doesn't go with the person. So intelligently saving his life by those yet wise words. I mean, always a good advisor, Geoffrey. So I didn't push him downstairs, and I waited for, you know, the ensuing revolution for the academics to defend their universities. And I have to say, I marched for the miners, but the miners did not march for me. And tragically, I had no chance of any work whatsoever. And I had just got married, and I had just had a new baby. So obviously, the only thing to do was to write a novel. And my novel, Wideacre, although I agree it has its light-hearted moments and indeed encouraging moments, it's also very much about the impact of the agricultural revolution on the workers of this imaginary 18th century estate. And it's absolutely drawn from the work that I was doing, looking at the circumstances of the 18th century and the way the novels really concealed the fact that what the class who were reading the novels was doing was impoverishing the people who worked on their estate. So it was a very interesting, in a sense, use. What I hadn't realised was that, of course, by reading 200 novels at the time when the art of the novel was being virtually invented, was that I had put myself on an intense 4-year crash course of how to write a novel. So when I came to write it, I had a real sense that it would fit, that it would work as a novel. And that work has been, in a sense, now my life's work, that every time I start a new novel, my task is to deploy everything I've learned about how to craft a novel. I do think, I know you have a creative writing course here, I do think there is a large part of inspiration and the absolute burning desire to tell a story, but there's also a craft that can be learned, and I'm still learning it, and I'm having a long and most enjoyable apprenticeship. I just wanted to finish up by telling you probably my most memorable experience at a library. I have to say that although the academic world is now, finally, after how many years, open to women, fully open to women, there is still in some institutions a little stickiness about women attending. I was in the Bodleian Library when I was something like 8 months pregnant with my daughter, and I am only a fairly small woman, and she was, bless her, a substantial baby, and I could not get through the turnstiles. So I stood there. I was a very, very strong feminist, I had to tell you. I stood there with my hair absolutely cropped in my dungarees with this enormous bump out in front of me, like that. And I said, you know, I need to come into the library. I am a student of the University of Edinburgh, and I expect to have access to this tax. And they called up the line, you know, until they found some aged misogynist, someone who was old enough and hated women enough to come down and open the other door and let me begrudgingly in. And so there was this huge awareness that a pregnant woman was coming into the Bodleian Library. And I came in and I ordered up the books I wanted to read. And as so often happened, these books had never been read by anybody before. They were 18th century novels and the pages were not cut. So with, you know, a mixture of defiance and horror, I had to take these books up to the chief librarian and ask him to cut the pages. So now there's a pregnant woman in dungarees in the Bodleian Library, and she wants the pages cut. So they take them off to their special page cutting room, and they send out the aged misogynist to bring them back to me, who puts them down on the desk, puts up, they have a special stand, puts up the special stand, opens the book, puts it on the desk, puts it in front of me, looks at me with nothing but contempt, and goes off to something else. And I, at some distance from the desk, as you can imagine, lean over the bunk and start reading. This would all be fine, except it's now about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, And round about that time, those of you who've had the joy of pregnancy will know, you like a little nap. And indeed, the little nap is absolutely inevitable. It would be like telling the tide not to come in. So I'm reading this 18th century novel in which Clarissa is telling Lucinda that her heart is elsewhere, but her father insists that she marries the boy, although he's now run away to sea and been seized by bandits. And my head's going like this. And I go, whoa, whoa, whoa. And my head goes like this. And then finally I go, whoom, down. And I go bang onto the stand and bang onto the book, and the book crashes on the desk, and everybody in the library looks up and goes, my God, there's a pregnant woman in the body. And now she's breaking the books. So I survived that, and I got my PhD, and I'm very grateful to that. And one of the greatest pleasures of the last couple of years is returning to Edinburgh and being greeted with such affection. And it is my pleasure to serve Edinburgh in any way that I can, as you have so kindly and generously served me. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippa. She's very kindly agreed to answer questions. So who would like to start the ball rolling?
I usually say at this point, you might as well, because I'm going in half an hour. And there's no point being sorry then. Yes?
Or do they just appear from nowhere?
The question is, how do I choose the subjects, or do they just appear from nowhere? I'm very lucky that I started about 8 years ago with the Boleyn family. I got very interested in Mary Boleyn, sister to Anne Boleyn, and no one had written very much about her before then. She led me on to, of course, the whole of the Tudor court. That particular book led me on to an interest in Catherine of Aragon, because she is so courageous and determined in the face of the difficulties that she experiences. So I wanted to know about her as a girl. That led me to a book called The Constant Princess, which is about Catherine of Aragon as girlhood. And then, in a sense, one book leads me to another. And now I have led myself back to the Plantagenets. And the next book, which will come out in August, is called The White Queen. And it's about Elizabeth Woodville, who is the wife of Edward IV and the mother of the princes in the Tower. And the big million-dollar question for the publishers and for myself is it true that everybody who loved the Tudors as much as I've done and bought my book so gratifyingly will like the Plantagenets as much? Or was it, in fact, just something about the Tudors? So there's a great deal of anxiety in London and New York at the moment, I have to tell you, to see how we do with the Plantagenets. My belief is that Plantagenets are actually more interesting than the Tudors. People know less about them, but they are tons badder and tons sexier and tons more disposed to murder their relatives than the Tudors. And this is the very stuff of novel. I mean, it is, of course, about consciousness and self-development and the rise of sensibility, but gosh, if you want murder, you know, Plantagenets are your boys. They really are great. Thank you. There was a question. Good, thank you. Thank you. That's one sale. Excellent.
I was University librarian here when we were doing your PhD, and I remember you coming into my room and wanting me to get on microfilm a complete set of these 18th century subscription library catalogues, and I had to say no.
Really?
But I think by that time you'd already got your...
My baby.
No, I think your
PhD.
Your PhD.
So what did I want you to do? I often have ideas for people.
32.
Yes, 32 circulating libraries, exactly.
Which I found in an old file not very long ago. And you said, wouldn't it be good, you said, if Edinburgh University Library could have sets of these, copies of these things? And I said, yes, it would. Do you still need them? You said, no, I finished using them. But you said it would be great to future generations.
Yes.
If Edinburgh could have a set of them. But there was no way we could justify the expense of getting them. And now we have a set for the history of the book. They'd probably give their right arms to them.
Well, I bet you nobody's ever wanted them before or since. No, they're academic in that sense and completely irrelevant to anybody's life. But
as you say, it's a lot of hidden resource.
yes, yes. I like hidden resources. Well, thank you. I'm sorry we couldn't do business before, but I'm sure.
I must have come across an elderly misogynist, I think. Misogynist, anyway.
I don't remember you as that, so that's good. Anyone else? Yes.
As you know, libraries are changing because of digitization. What do you think about Google's project to put all the books in the world online? Is it a good thing or a bad thing?
I think it's a terrifying thing. I was very struck last night when I was going to give a talk in David Hume Tower. I wanted to compare how Jean Clady wrote a scene, which I know she's written, with how I had written a scene. And I went to the Edinburgh City Library and I went to Waterstones, and neither of them had the relevant Jean Clady book, though thank God they had mine. So I was pleased about that. So I couldn't do it. And then I went, hang on a minute, I'll go on Amazon, I'll go and look inside, I'll go and search for the name of the place where it happened, and I got both extracts without buying the books. I do believe that the digitisation is going to create a massive change in the book publishing business, in the publishing business, and it is my bet that what's going to happen is that you're going to have a cheap form of publishing, downloadable audio books, print on demand, print off your own laptop, print sections, and paperbacks. And then there's going to be a huge gap in the market, and then there's going to be deluxe luxury editions, which people will still buy for the people who love a book in their hand. I'm one of those people who loves a book in their hand, and most readers still are. But I think kids who are brought up on Kindle and brought up on the Sony reader, they're going to love the feel of that in their hand. That's what they're going to associate. So that doesn't answer your question, but it was a nice run out for me. I'm torn about it because I think actually for me to be able to say you could sit in your home and have access to the contents of the Library of Congress, of the British Library, of everything that's ever written. This is achieving a level of culture and diversity, globalization of the written word, which is it's on a par with the Gutenberg press. It's huge. It's incredibly hopeful. On the other hand, knowing how hard it is for writers to make a living, I'm very anxious about how we protect the copyright of particularly writers who have written maybe one textbook, which everybody's going to buy and everybody's going to use, but if they can download it for free, how do we protect those writers? So I think the issue of the internet and copyright is absolutely the one that we should all be addressing and dealing with as a matter of absolute urgency, because it's running away from us now. Yes?
When you see films made from books, historical films like William Wallace or whatever it is, people tend to say, oh, it's nothing like the truth. Now, your Plantagenet stories or whatever, how much is fantasy and how much is truth?
I always start from the historical record because I trained as a historian, and that's what I'm interested in. So I start with about, I do about a year's research on any particular book, and then that gives me the framework of the story and the timeline. The fiction comes about for two things. One, it's the conversations that we don't know. We know they happen because we see the decisions, but we don't know who said what to whom. So that's fictionalized. It's the stuff behind closed doors and the secrets that if you're a historian, you can say, perhaps on the one hand this happened, perhaps on the other hand this happened. I'm writing in first person. I'm writing in present tense. I don't have the luxury of being able to speculate about what happened because I am the person and I'm saying what happened, so I've got to take a decision. So I always decide what seems to me the most likely, and I decide on the basis of the historical evidence and the most likely thing to have happened. I never decide in terms of it would make a better story one way or another. Actually, almost always, the truth is much more surprising and interesting than anything one could make up. And then finally, I suppose the fiction part of it is shaping it. So what I choose to write about, just as a historian chooses to write about the men going to battle, the layout of the flags, the standards, the charge, the time that somebody turns up, whether he's late or not. I choose to write about the women behind the throne, the plotting behind the throne. The battles are there, but they're not of the greatest of interest to me. So I write history from my perspective and my interest, and that's the selection process that goes on. The final bit about making a novel out of it is that I never start at the beginning. Whenever I read a historical novel and it says, the thin cry of the newborn child echoed round the cold battlements of the castle, I go, oh, get a life. Really, everybody gets born, it's not clever, it's not interesting, nobody does it particularly idiosyncratically. What's interesting is when the characters start to bend their will on the world. So almost all my novels start, in a sense, round about the middle of the story. And they, as far as I can, they don't end with death, because everybody dies. I'm writing about people 500 years ago, they're all dead, it's awfully sad. It's terribly depressing, and the Americans simply can't bear it. So I tend to try and finish with a sort of in a sense, a rounding out, but that's a fictional thing. That's making the novel work as a novel. So something about the beginning tells you where you're going to be at the end. And that's satisfying for me as a novelist as well as a historian. But in my view, if you're writing a historical fiction, it's got to be both things. It's got to be completely historical, and it's got to be a successful fiction. Anyone else?
The Anne Boleyn novel was made into a film. How much were you involved in transforming it into a film?
I can't tell you how important I was in the making of the Anne Boleyn film. I cannot tell you how significant my role and how cherished I was as a writer. They hired me to be a consultant, and so they sent me copies of the script in a very friendly, very loyal way, very, very helpfully. And I came downstairs one day with the script in my hand, trembling to my husband, and said, "They're doing this with it!" And he works in business, and he's fairly shrewd, and he said to me, "Remind me, are you the director?" I said, "No." He said, "Are you perhaps the leading lady?" I said, "No." He said, "Are you the scriptwriter?" I said, "No." He said, "What are you?" I said, "I'm a consultant." He said, "Then write them an email." So I wrote them an email and said, "I have to point out to you that this is historically incorrect, that we'll get complaints about this, that this is really embarrassing, that this didn't happen in the novel nor in the history." And they wrote me back and said, "Thank you very much for your contribution." That was the end of it. They had done their job, they had consulted me, I had done my job, which I was paid, I had consulted with them, and we had completed our transaction as far as that went. I have to say the film I thought was very beautiful, beautifully filmed, very thoughtfully written. It was written by Peter Morgan, who that year was getting an Oscar for The Queen. It stars the fabulously beautiful Scarlett Johannson, Natalie Portman, and Eric Banner, all of whom I met and went down and went to the film. I was at the Royal Gala premiere, didn't curtsy. Such a Republican. Can you imagine the shock? Not at all. There was a line of us, and Charles and, I beg your pardon, Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall are coming along, and the whisper goes down the line, "Philippa's not going to curtsy. Philippa doesn't curtsy to royals." And Scarlett Johansson's beside me, and Natalie's beside her, and Scarlett says to me, "You don't curtsy?" I said, "No, I don't curtsy, I'm a Republican." She says, "I'm an American, I'm damned if I'm curtsying." And Natalie Portman said, "I went to ballet class, I've waited all my life to curtsy." She went, So, if there's no more questions, I think that's probably about it. Any last There's always one.
I find that so interesting, thank you very much. But what I was wondering was, how do you know about where to get your resources for somebody as old as Anne Boleyn and the family then? Do you go to lots of different places, or do you find them all in one place?
The source material for the Boleyns and the Tudors, it's a pretty well-trod field. The Victorians were absolutely bonkers about the Tudors. They, in a sense, love them like we do. And I think it's something about, in a sense, you choose a historical period that speaks to you. And I'm sure the Victorians with, a woman on the throne were really interested in Elizabeth, and with an empire were interested in the start of empire that is Elizabeth. So the Victorians did a huge amount of transcribing of the original documents, translating them from Latin, which I don't have, and translating them from French and Spanish, which they're also occurring. So they have, in a sense, all of the papers absolutely turned into English, translated into English, and not edited. So you can go and read them. There's a lot of documents that survive in the Records Office, and the Victorian historians themselves did a great deal of research. We find more objects still about the Tudors, so there's a little bit of stuff emerges now and then. So the Vatican's just released some papers, the letters between Henry and Anne, and they're in the British Library, and you can see them now, and that's the first time they've been released in 500 years, so that's phenomenal. So everyone's all over that like a rash. And then occasionally you get a new portrait which emerges or becomes authenticated as of somebody that we didn't know it was of. But by and large, all the material's in the public domain, and a lot of it is as secondary. And as a writer of fiction, I don't really have to go and see the original documents. I work mostly from the secondary stuff. What I do is I spend a lot of time at some of the Tudor palaces, and I have the privilege of I often am invited to go and give talks at the Tudor palaces. And I was at the Tower very, very late one night, and we'd done a talk, and we were just taking the chairs apart, and everything was finishing, and we were leaving. And one of the curators of the tower came by and said that, did I believe in ghosts? And I said, well, of course. Of course, I'm a novelist. You know, they're talking to me all the time. And he said, it's so odd because there was a room in his house, he lives in the tower, that none of his children would sleep in because they see a figure go through. And I just went, oh, how wonderful. And I came out and it was very, very, very quiet, and there was a moon, and there was Tower Green where Anne was beheaded, and Jane Rochford, and Catherine Howard. And there was a moment and I went like, if I'm ever going to see them, I'll see them now. You know, I stood there for half an hour. You know, but they're not queens to be summoned. I'm sure they would come in their own good time. And there are times when I do feel very, very close to them, and I do go to the sites where they lived with a desire to see both the landscape that they knew and loved, get a sense of just the air and the colour and the feel of the place. But in terms of direct research, it's very bookish. It's very libraries. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Philippa, for that riveting tour through your experiences of libraries and your writing career. I was first introduced to your work by Peter Freshwater, a former convener of the Business Committee of the General Council, and in his professional life, as he's just said, the Deputy Librarian of Edinburgh University Library. And I know from Peter how well you used the libraries during your time here. In an interview you gave last year, you said of the university, of the lectures themselves and the education, it was just of the highest possible quality. These people, when you spoke to them, even in casual conversation, you knew you were learning something beneficial and important. The library was a superb resource too. I think, though, that you used very well what you learned here, along with your own talents, to combine your two research passions, that of history, especially of the 16th century, and 18th century literature, to excel, as you have now, in the genre of fictional biography, where you take real people and you present their lives with creative imagination, but also with painstaking research from your studies. That's been, I think, particularly well done in the case of Mary Boleyn in the Other Boleyn Girl. My favourite, though, among your more than 20 novels to date, is A Respectable Trade, which is based in Bristol and explores in depth the reality of slavery in England. I think it's very interesting to reflect that you have examined this topic for England, and another University of Edinburgh graduate, James Robertson, has explained the same theme in Scotland in his book, Joseph Knight. Your career so far has been full of distinctions, and the latest accolade, which Alan referred to earlier, is that last evening in George Square, you were created an honorary writing fellow of the University of Edinburgh, so many congratulations. Your university and your fellow graduates are immensely proud of your achievements, and not just your writing career, but also your work in the Gambia. We thank you tremendously warmly for coming to speak to us today, and we wish you every success in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Anne Matheson, for that wonderful vote of thanks. Almost all of you will know that, sadly, Anne is retiring as Secretary of the General Council at the end of July this year. And at our business meeting, we said how grateful we were for the dedication she has shown to the General Council and Edinburgh University over the last 8 years, and we're extremely grateful. Also, Melvyn Cornish, the Secretary of the University, was able to announce at that meeting that Anne is being given, and she's kindly agreed to accept an honorary degree, honoris causa, by University of Edinburgh. Now that is the end of the proceedings today. The next meeting, the next half-yearly meeting, is on Saturday the 13th of February in the Old Quad. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed your lunch. And for those who are going on the tours of the building, they will be starting at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much.